Well, as luck would have it, the indicator light came a day after I made the box. So the thing to do is to put it together and then put it in the box. So I've already pre-cut this wire, and the first thing to do, like before, is to crimp it. There's one, and now we'll do another. Like that. Nicely crimped. Good. And now the thing to do is to solder it onto the indicator light. And in fact, before I do that, what I'm going to do is put some heat shrink on. What I'm going to do is put some heat shrink over the cable, like this, and like that. And now I will solder it onto these terminals. This is going to be perhaps a little bit tricky. It's going to be tricky because these holes over here are kind of tiny, and we'll just see if we can get the wire through them. And yeah, not great, but it'll be, well, good enough. Let's try that again. That will do it. There's a few stragglers, and I'm just going to bend them so they're in place, and then we'll just hold the wire down using these two things. A clamp would be better, but I'm too lazy to get one. Maybe I've got to get something else like this. Let's try that again. Yeah. And now, using the trusty old soldering gun with a nice new tip, we will solder it together. Perfect. Well, not perfect, but again, good enough. Yeah, there's a few globs of solder. Maybe I'll just, do I dare try and take it off? Yeah. Now we'll do the other side again. Try and get this wire that's just a little bit too big through the holes as best as we can. Bend them over like that. Hold them in place with this. Hold the indicator light like that. And now we'll solder that one. Actually, there's a piece of wire that's going to be a nuisance. There we go. There we go. Once again, there's a bit of a glob. How does that look now? Still a glob. Let's try and get rid of it. I don't know if you can see that. It's better. So now if the globs aren't too big, we can push the heat shrink over them. And of course they are pretty big, but that's probably good enough. That's one heat shrink. And that's another heat shrink. And now what we'll do is shrink the heat shrink. To shrink the heat shrink, I'm going to use this paint stripper gun. You can actually buy special heat shrinking guns that cost a lot more, but a cheap gun is more than enough. There we go. Nicely shrunk. And now we'll let that cool down, and while it cools, I will take the cover off the now installed box and drill a hole for that in it. Okay, so here's where I want to put the hole, and I've already marked it on the bottom here. So the first thing I'll do is put a little indent so it makes it easier to drill right. And now what we'll do is we'll use this drill, which is a slightly narrower version of that tapered drill we used before, to drill the hole. But first we'll actually drill a little pilot hole to make centering it a bit easier. One thing I want to do before I drill it, and I just remembered to do this, was we'll measure the hole size we need. Now the hole size is of course in the specs for the indicator lamp, but it's always good to do a measurement, and here we go. It's about 15 millimeters or so. So let's just look here and see what that corresponds to, and it corresponds to around here. So what I'm going to do on this drill is just mark about how far I should be drilling, and let's just verify that again. Yeah, so if I get to that point, I'm probably going to be about the right size, and then what we'll do is we'll just test it to make sure that I've got it before I drill too big a hole. So let's go do the drilling now. Okay, so let's measure it now, and what do we get here? We get about 15. That's probably about right. And well, that's sort of showing 13. It's pretty close. I'm not going to use the drill anymore. I'm going to take it off, and we'll see if this fits through, and if it doesn't, I'll use a file to make it, well, just marginally bigger, because I'd rather be careful than drill a hole that's too big and this thing just goes right through it. So very quickly take it off the jig. Those screws are just too big. And now let's see if it fits. I'll bet you it's just a little too small, but we'll know in a minute. Of course, I would be a lot smarter if I took the securing nut off the indicator light and just put it down so we don't lose it. And yeah, there's actually a lip, so I'm going to need to file it anyway, but let's just see how close we are. We're not too close, so let's just see if I can hand file it. If that doesn't work too well, we'll get out maybe the Dremel and use that. Actually, that's still somewhat of a lip. I suspect it still won't go through. Let's try it. No, it's still not enough. So I think what I'm going to do is put in a grinding bit instead, and we'll use that. Okay, so we'll just put in this grinding bit. And see if we can use that to fix this up a bit. And of course, I've made a mess here. Oh, we're almost there, just slightly bigger. So we'll just clean up the bottom side. And let's see. And it fits. Perfect. So now all we need to do is put this through, and it is the right side. And there is a little washer, and that would actually be to make the fitting somewhat waterproof, I would suspect. And even though this is not a waterproof thing, we will use it anyway. It's a nice rubber washer, so it'll certainly make the thing a little bit more forgiving when we tighten it. There. And now hand-to-tight for a plastic fitting like this is probably fine. And other than the little nick I did here, this looks pretty good. So I'm going to now put this back on the box. I won't show you while I'm doing it because there really isn't space for me and the camera, but I will show you the finished product. Let's see if it works. I'm just going to switch it on by shorting the on circuit. And it does. The light lights. Okay, so what I've done is I've strung this cable from the control box down here all the way into the workshop. And I'm going to show you the other end right now. So here's the other end of the wire in the workshop, and I've just installed it coming through this post in the middle of the room. And the one thing you might notice is it has less wires than the other end, and that's because I didn't have a long enough piece of HVAC cable. So what I actually did was splice them together in the ceiling. And on this post, what I'm going to do is install a utility box, this one over here in the center, and use that to mount the timer switch. And because it is a low voltage control circuit, I'm not going to really worry about the fact that I don't have any sort of a clamp or cable holder at the back of the box. To install the box, we'll place it over the wire, and I do have this thing tight around the wire just to make sure it doesn't go all the way in the pole. And now all we need to do is put a couple of screws in here to hold the box in place. That, of course, was one screw falling on the ground. That looks about right. Yeah. Now we'll do the other screw. Looks good. So now what we have to do is attach the timer switch to that. And here's the timer switch, so we'll just cut it open. And I guess what we have to do is pull the knob off and take the switch off the faceplate. And what I'm probably going to do is actually change the faceplate, because what I don't want is these sharp things over here potentially scraping someone if you walk past and touch the post. We'll have to see. Anyway, let's look at the wires that come out of this. There's a ground, and there's a ground there, and it looks like we somehow have to pry this back end off. Oh no, you may or may not be able to see it, but there are screws in here, so we can put in a wire here and here to control whatever it is the switch is controlling. So that's what we'll do. What I did off camera was I stripped a little bit more of the brown insulation off so we have more space to work. In doing so, I cut my finger. Don't do that if you're trying to repeat this project at home. Anyway, the first thing we're going to do is attach the ground wire, then we'll attach the two switched wires, and then we're done. And I actually did try this before and made a little bit mess of the ground wire, but it's low voltage, low current. I don't really mind about the one broken strand. Anyway, here it is. And we'll just tighten it in nicely. The utility box is now grounded. It's always a good thing that if you have something that's exposed metal, actually not just a good thing, it really should be grounded, just to make sure that if anything were to go wrong, there's at least one level of protection. So we'll use a MAR connector to connect these together, like that. And that's the ground. And now we will shove the active cables, the switched cables, into the side here. This is really a kind of awkward way of doing this. It's very hard to see if they're under the screw or not. That's one. And that's the other. They both feel secure. So all we need to do now is attach this to the box. I've just realized something. I actually want to use this nice, slightly safer rounded plate, which I'm going to put on like that and drill a hole in the middle. I won't bother showing you drilling the hole. But one of the things is these two screws here corresponds to, and again, I don't know how well you can see it, these two screws that are going to hold this in place. So what I'm actually going to do is first drill the center hole in the cover, change these short screws, possibly with slightly longer ones if I need it, and then put the cover on. We'll probably see if these are long enough, and they just might be. And really, this is not the way you would normally do it, but again, I really don't like the sharp ends of the cover that came with the box, or with the timer switch. Hole is drilled. Let's see if it fits. And it actually does. So we'll tighten it up. And I'm going to look and see, and it looks like the screw holes are in fact in place. So I'm just going to get those original screws and we'll see if they fit. Okay, let's just see if the original screws fit, and I think they actually will. Yes. Very nice. Here's the other. Or did I speak too soon? No. Nice and secure. The wire is attached to the compressor. Let's see what happens. And it works. And let's see if it goes off. It does. So one last thing, I'm just going to mark off here and 60 here and maybe 30 here, and there, the compressor set to run for 60 minutes. Now that everything is installed and working, I thought it'd be worth going over some of the key components. And the first one is the contactor. And I got this contactor from Amazon. Interestingly enough, a few days ago it was over 40 bucks. Now it's back down to 23, close to what I had originally paid for it. And the really neat thing is if you try and buy a relay, which is generally a lower powered version of a contactor, they often cost a lot more because they're produced on a more specialty basis, whereas these types of contactors are produced by the gazillion for things like air conditioning compressors, and that's also why they're available on Amazon and places like that. The one thing I did want to do was point out some of the specs that you have to consider with things like contactors. We're going to run it at 240 volts, so that's easy enough. And it gives a number of ratings. This is the full load amps. In other words, when your load, in our case the compressor motor, is running at full power, what's the maximum current it can draw. This contactor is rated at 40. The compressor that I have is rated at 15. So this is well above and beyond what I need. The other rating is the locked rotor amps, and what that is the current that can be drawn when the motor is started up from being stationary. In other words, when the motor is not turning, the instant you turn it on, it will draw way more current than it normally does when operating. And you can see this is a much larger number than that. The typical proportion between the two is, for a rule of thumb, the locked rotor amps is maybe 6 times the full load amps. Can be a bit more, can be a bit less. It all depends on the motor. Anyway, again, this is way in excess of anything my compressor is ever going to produce, and so that's typically acceptable as well. There are plenty of contactors out there with a 30 for the full load amps and correspondingly less locked rotor amps, and that would be fine too if you're looking for a slightly more inexpensive solution, but I always like to sort of put in a bit of overkill just to make it last the longest. The next thing we used was the transformer to provide 24 volts, and again, this was a standard HVAC transformer. It is a class 2. They have a class LI, but it's actually class 2 like that. And what a class 2 transformer is a transformer that is actually, one way or another, current limited on the 24 volts output to essentially remove the risk of fire if there was a short or anything like that. And these transformers are typically used for things like air conditioners and furnaces and things like that. In this case, that is true COVID pricing. It really should be something like half that, and there were other brands available on Amazon that are more in line of what the price should be. Finally, this is the indicator lamp that I used. I got it from DigiKey, a well-known electronics supplier. There's the part number, and it cost around $5. And as you saw, works rather well. So since we're on the topic of pricing, here's what the whole project cost. And I have two costs. Here's my cost, which basically includes everything that I had to buy new: the contactor, the transformer, and the indicator lamp, but also stuff that I scrounged. And I scrounged them from the Habitat for Humanity Restore and from my parts bin, and really achieved a considerable savings. It cost me probably somewhere around $69 to put the whole thing together. If I'd had to buy all of these items new from a place like Home Depot, it would probably cost around $180, over $100 more than what I originally paid. And this is no criticism of Home Depot. These prices are completely reasonable, but it's always fun when you're building something for your workshop to do it as inexpensively as possible. And I'm actually quite thrilled with that pricing. So that's that project. Until next time.